Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to advocate and educate about the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. And a lot has changed. A whole lot has changed since we last discussed Ukraine on this podcast a few weeks ago. The United States under Trump has switched sides in the Russo-Ukrainian war. He's on the Russian side now. Under Biden, at least, the U.S. condemned the Russian invasion and provided some economic and military support to Ukraine, even if it had a lot of strings attached and came too little and too late for the Ukrainians to successfully defeat the invading Russian army and push it out of Ukraine. Now Trump and his minions are accepting Russian demands and rejecting Ukrainian demands regarding a peace settlement. Trump has called Zelensky a dictator. He said Ukraine started the war. He's refusing in joint resolutions now before the UN General Assembly that reiterates what they've done in the past, and that is call for Russian troops to withdraw and respect Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity. And then at the G7, he's opposing a resolution that calls Russia the aggressor. So he's trying to rewrite history that didn't happen. Russia invaded Ukraine and should pay reparations to Ukraine. But Trump is demanding that Ukraine pay reparations to the U.S. His administration proposed this minerals deal where U.S. gets 50% of the profits from rare earth and industrial minerals in perpetuity. That's like old-fashioned. It's not even old-fashioned. It's neo-colonialism. And if Ukraine doesn't accept this deal, the U.S. threatens to cut off all economic and military aid to Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine's already cut off humanitarian aid that was going through USAID. It affects millions of war refugees, hundreds of thousands of HIV/AIDS patients, people without heat and water, farmers, wounded veterans, and many more people. So Trump is getting together with Putin to carve up Ukraine between U.S. imperialism and Russian imperialism. And he's blowing up the Western alliance. The West has often violated its stated commitments to democracy and human rights and the respect of international law against military aggression. But now Trump is openly trashing those stated commitments with respect to the human rights of Ukrainians. And then he's turning around and calling for the U.S. to own Gaza and annex Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal. And in Europe, they're messing into politics. There's an election tomorrow in Germany, and Trump and Vance are openly supporting the neo-fascist alternative for Deutschland. It's really a question now whether the Europeans are ever going to trust America again. And Trump is joining Putin in dividing up what Putin calls a multipolar world. It's really a multi-imperialist world with, a few big empires, particularly the U.S., Russia, and China. So that's briefly how I see it. And I wanted to bring on Vladyslav Starodubtsev. He's a Ukrainian leftist to talk about the current situation. He's a Ukrainian historian and left-wing social activist. He's the author of numerous articles on the topic of progressive political movements in Ukrainian history, with a particular focus on the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 to 1921, and on Ukrainian dissidents. We have a lot of links to articles and interviews by Vladyslav that we'll be posting as we go along. In fact, we got 10 links. So I suggest as we go along, copy those, put them in a document, and then when you have time, you can view them later. So welcome, Vladyslav. Let's start with your view of the current situation. What are Ukrainians, and particularly the Ukrainian left, feeling about the situation since Trump, started creating all this havoc the last couple of weeks?
Yes, thank you, Howie. We are, to be honest, in a very undecided and chaotic situation. It's in Ukraine. There are a lot of stuff about peace negotiation, and it seems that Ukrainian oligarchy, independently of American actions, also adopted the position that they want to go for some kind of peace negotiation, because to organize defense of Ukrainian people would mean more attacks on neoliberal system, more mobilization of resources, more mobilization of economy, something that goes against this idea of individualistic neoliberal system that is right now nurtured by Ukrainian oligarchs. So there is a push by elites and oligarchs to try to force on the society this idea that there's a need of some kind of negotiation and agreement with Russia. And right now, Ukraine is in somewhat chaotic situation where from one side there is push from elites to organize some negotiations. From another side, there's Trump who tries to push the same negotiation, but on the terms that are unacceptable even for the most vile parts of Ukrainian oligarchy. And of course, Russia, who probably doesn't want any peace and wants to continue its imperial conquest and use the situation for its gains on the front line and for weakening of Ukraine. In all of this situation, it's practically for everyone in Ukraine is extremely important to just stick together and do what's best, contribute to humanitarian aid, especially with the cuts from USAID. A lot of veteran organizers, a lot of humanitarian aid for refugees were cut. And what's also important, a lot of independent media and a lot of people who were investigating corruption were cut. And in this situation, we have rising influence of Ukrainian oligarchs who now have more control over media and less oversight. And at the same time, we have a lot more people who are in dire need of help that was previously provided by the US. And now people need to put practically 10x more of their energy to just compensate in some way the cuts that were made for Trump. It's extremely dangerous situation, and there are no good solutions in the moment. And we are entering in practically a decide one of the most important years in Ukrainian history, where a lot of questions would be decided, and actions of Trump put US on the side of in the negotiation on the side of Russia, and they're trying to strengthen actually their negotiating power, which makes it so much more harder for Ukraine. It also there are possibilities of cutting necessary, not only already given military and humanitarian aid, but also the services that Ukrainians are using. Recently, I think yesterday, Musk threatened Ukraine if Ukraine wouldn't accept this neo-colonial deal about minerals to cut Starlinks. And Starlinks are important mean of communication in the army that couldn't be silenced or shut down by radio technologies. So it's US actively not only forcing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, but sabotaging Ukrainian military effort, and it would be catastrophic. So, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned, some of the things Trump is doing. Another thing is they cut in the Department of Justice, the group that was enforcing sanctions and investigating corruption with respect to Ukrainians. So, it's let the criminals run loose. And, Trump is a gangster. I mean, he's got criminal convictions and a lot of stuff he's got away with. So it's a bad situation. When I was in Ukraine in November, it was when Trump was elected. And I know you and people like Taras Billis were, pretty down because of, you saw it as a huge victory for the global far right in Europe and how it's going to affect Ukraine. And as I talked to other people, not on the left in Ukraine, but just regular people, they would always ask me, is Trump really going to be able to end this war? They were kind of hopeful. Has that changed at all since, Trump, given what Trump's done the last couple of weeks?
Absolutely. I think there was kind of effort to manufacture consent about Trump's presidency. There were a lot of media campaigns, especially by these neoliberal people and by the elites who wanted some kind of peace negotiation to present Trump as kind of viable, serious solution who would be hard but just and who would help to bring some kind of just end and who would be harsher on Russia than Biden. But of course, it was nonsense. And now we see how after all of this media campaign to justify Trump, it always comes tumbling down practically. And Ukraine, I think, in November was one of the most highest ranked countries in Europe where there was support for Trump. I think around 40% of Ukrainians thought that Trump presidency would be good for Ukraine. And now the support are absolutely collapsing. Ukrainians are realizing what a horrible situation with Trump presidency in White House would be. And now a lot of people trying to adapt and just to find new solutions, new ways to organize to this new situation. So yeah, I would say there were a lot of illusions about Trump, and now there are hardly any.
How are people regarding Zelensky now since Trump called him a dictator? Are people rallying around him to some extent?
Yes, yes. From one side, there are a lot of Ukrainians who obviously pissed off on the all attempts of US to force negotiation and delegitimize Ukrainian government. I would say that probably Zelensky ratings are higher, but it's not even in the ratings. A lot of politicians come and said that all the demands about elections, no matter the ratings of Zelensky, are absolutely irrelevant and they're dangerous during the wartime. The situation is that elections are by design something that brings division and brings conflicts, and it's good. For elections, you need to plural opinions and discussions, but in the wartime, they create weaknesses that could be easily exploited by Russia. They could be exploited by sabotage and political propaganda. They could be exploited by just military attacks on the voting booths and voting places. And they could be used, all of these discussions, all of the divisions that goes on in electoral campaigns, to organize counteroffensives or new offensive on the front line. So this Trump push for election obviously giving counter push from practically everyone in Ukrainian society to just stop this nonsense. Nobody wants to organize any elections, and it is not a matter of Zelensky ratings. So, but some of the leaders right now of the opposition try to exploit this and organize their own political gains. To be honest, very awful political games where they try to say that Zelensky made a mistake in negotiating Trump. He was too harsh to Trump, and because of that, Trump now turned against Ukraine. So a lot of populism, a lot of different politicians trying to practically divide Ukrainians and gain political capital in this situation, unfortunately.
What are the prospects for the left if there are elections? I saw an article by Vitaly Dudin where he talked about, the struggle of labor in Ukraine and said, it's going to need a voice if there are elections. What's that look like for the left in Ukraine?
I believe that the left could right now organize on the level of municipalities. It's something that left already gained enough power to go and fight for positions in city parliaments, city municipalities, and get their candidates there. I think there's a real chance to have the left first in 10 years to be represented on some level, on some elected level. And for example, in Kyiv, you need 5% to get to Kyiv municipality, and left already on this level that it is possible. But unfortunately, there is no possibility, as I see it, to organize the left for national elections. There's just not enough power, and I don't think that there any force that could garner social dissatisfaction after the peace negotiation or something and create some kind of new powerful left-wing force. But we have slow and steady progress, and possibly there will be candidates to fill positions of municipalities when there would be elections. I would say that there's slow progress on the Ukrainian left, and I would say there are a lot of illusions, especially on the West, who think that people who would be dissatisfied and face all the social problems after the war could bring effective social change. But in practice, there are just not enough political conscience, not enough discussions, not enough organizational capacities for something like this to happen. Ukrainians are still, unfortunately, dominated by this egoistic libertarian ideology, and Ukrainian political powers are controlled by oligarchs. So it's hard even on the stage of creating a party that will go to national parliament. It's practically impossible to create a new political party because the electoral laws are designed to have designed before 2014, and they need signatures from Crimea to create a new party. So those who want to register a party now after the war practically need to semi-legally buy some parties that already exist and try to run from their part. But it costs so much money that it's a very hard task that I think left could barely manage.
Wow, it sounds harder than the U.S., which is really hard to, get on the ballot. We get attacked by the Democrats, and the Democrats and Republicans set the law, so it's hard for any challenge to the two corporate party system. Is there anything else before we talk about some history that you want to tell people about the current situation?
Yes, I think in Ukraine, there's this dominance of neoliberalism that really harms the war effort. Right now, we need all our resources to mobilize to secure the front line, to help our defensive effort, to organize on the very left-wing principle of sharing the burden. I don't accept the pacifist rhetoric. I think that one of the greatest left-wing principle is just to sharing the responsibilities, sharing all the traumas, and just sharing collective struggles amongst itself, helping each other. And something like this needs to have some collective ethos, some kind of thinking about common good, thinking about class interest, and so on, which is not present in Ukrainian politicum. Because of this, because all of this libertarian rhetorics, it just sabotages the war effort by itself. It's just creates this situation where everyone from the politicians speak about enriching yourself, opening the business, organizing massive tax cuts, and all of this rhetoric of individual gain. For people, it's harder to understand why should I go to the war and defend other people if I should think only about myself. And it's hard to organize war economy when the main discourse is about cutting tax, how we could mobilize and centralize resources to produce rockets and tanks and weapons that are needed to secure our people and just save lives of people, organize help for refugees, and so on. And unfortunately, government does horrible self-sabotage in this effort. And in many ways, they're putting interests of elite higher than interests of national defense and just people's welfare. And that's extremely problematic. That's internal challenge of Ukrainian politics. And unfortunately, US elections making it only worse. Because with success of Trump, a lot of people, a lot of elites trying to copy Trump discourse, they're trying to find this new populist possibilities for political gains in Ukraine. A lot of them practically copied Trump's rhetoric without any grounds in Ukraine. A lot of them tried to create a version of DEI rhetoric in Ukraine. They're speaking about that we have these quotas for different minorities, and because of it, everything bad. But the difference is that Ukraine doesn't have anything of this. They're just copying something that worked for Trump, and they're using it. They're attacking minorities for their political gain in Ukraine. Unfortunately, we have this shift to more populism with it. So, unfortunately, with Trump elections and with political instability in Ukraine, a lot of these oligarchs just trying to capitalize on new possibilities, and it creates the need for civil society to organize a counterforce, which is tries to do, and sometimes successfully, but it creates so much more challenges, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, when I was in Ukraine, one of the things I heard often from people on the left is that the Western left, the international left, needs to support the left in Ukraine, because the neoliberal policies you're talking about is incentivized and pushed by the U.S. government through the way bonds, are sold by Ukraine, conditions from the International Monetary Fund for loans, and just the whole, reconstruction aspect coming from the U.S. government. And this was from Biden before we got to Trump, which incentivizes the oligarchs in Ukraine to adopt these neoliberal policies. They think that's how they will get Western investment. The other thing I just want to say is, the broad progressive left, liberals, progressives, radicals support Ukraine in the United States. The polls show that. but we have a small but very vocal minority of campus, people that are in the Russian camp, authoritarian leftist groups, and their presence on online, and also dogmatic campus. I mean, it's got so bad that you have the supposed pacifist Medea Benjamin praising Trump's initiatives on these peace deals without looking at the content of how it's screwing Ukraine. People like Ray McGovern, a former CIA guy that's anti-U.S. imperialism, but very much pro-Russian. He said the other day he voted for Trump, and he's so happy Trump started these negotiations. And those of us on the international left that, want to support people struggling for the working class and oppressed people everywhere need to speak up, because we're getting drowned out in this country. And what people on the left in Ukraine were telling me, it matters what we say. This is not isolated, and it affects their morale as well as the politics in Ukraine, because regular Ukrainians, when they hear the international left sound pro-Putin, they say, I don't want nothing to do with the left. And it makes it hard for people like Vladyslav to organize. So let's also get to his specialty as a historian, which is about, the role of the left in the long history of the struggle for Ukrainian independence, going back to the 19th century and the Ukrainian People's Republic at the time of the Russian Revolution. Why don't you, give us a brief, synopsis of, that history, so people understand. I mean, the rhetoric we get from the campus is that Ukrainians are a bunch of Nazis or neo-Nazis, and there's a very different history there. And it's not like Ukrainian independence was invented by Lenin and the Russian Revolution, like Putin says, or even, the independence referendum in 1991, but it goes way back. So, tell us about that.
Yeah, with pleasure. I would say that sometimes in Ukrainian history, I tried to find a lot of left-wing symbolism and a lot of left-wing symbols and tried to look for it. And then one day I understood very crucial thing, that Ukrainian national symbols are practically the left-wing symbols. Ukrainian identity was so interconnected with left-wing movement that the way that left-wing movements in Ukraine were identifying itself were through national symbols. And for people on the left who come to Ukraine and we meet them, I usually show Ukrainian money. And on the majority of Ukrainian this paper money, there some person from socialist movement. Nearly always there are like a few persons from Middle Ages, and others, nearly all of them are from socialist movements. So like on 100 hryvnias, on I think 50 hryvnias, on 20 hryvnias, they're all of the socialist activists. They're Taras Shevchenko, they're Mikhailo Grushevsky, Ivan Franko. They all participated in some kind of social movements, in some kind of movements for equality, and it practically was the basis of Ukrainian movement. And in Ukraine, usually when we speak about political movements, we start with Taras Shevchenko. He's very fundamental for Ukrainian history, for Ukrainian identity. Everywhere where you could see Ukrainian community, you could see symbols about Shevchenko, portraits, memoirs, sculptures, everything. And what is very interesting, that Shevchenko was practically a radical Republican activist in Ukraine. And he was very inclusive too, and was very progressive. In his political activism, he agitated for Ukraine without Tsars, without kings ruling of it, but a republic of equals in terms of not only social and political sense, but also economic sense. It was pretty much a Christian movement, and they used analogies with early Christian communities where everything was owned equally by the community. And in their political programs and rhetorics, they always try to underline kind of this agrarian justice, agrarian equality, where people should be relatively equal to have proper political representation, where rich wouldn't dominate poor and poor wouldn't be living in misery. And that was practically the powerful message that resonated from Taras Shevchenko for future Ukrainian generations. And it was also very inclusive message because while Taras Shevchenko was pretty much a very Christian author, he many times supported different struggles of people of different religions, different backgrounds that you could find very unusual. For example, in one of his most famous poems, Caucasus, he supports mountain people of Caucasus fighting against Russian imperialism. And he says for practically Muslim and pagan fighters that God is on their side because on their side is truth, which he thinks of truth as kind of human development, democracy, anti-colonialism. Practically truth is where people are freely living and developing. So he says that God is on the side of Muslim and pagan resistance against Russian imperialism. And Russia was Christian Orthodox state. So he was very inclusive and practically very forward thinking for his time about anti-colonialism, about these uniting struggles across the vast amount of lands against imperialism and against colonialism across cultures. He also had a friendship with Black American struggling with the history of obviously slavery in US, and they bonded with each other on sharing wide experience of slavery of in case of Ukraine of serfdom and also slave trade in Crimea, and in case in US of course slave ownership in US South. So a lot of this inclusivity and social progressivism was at core of Ukrainian political movement from the start, from thoughts of Shevchenko and his experience, and from his political organizations that then practically planted the seeds of all other political movements in Ukraine. At the same time, there was formation of Ukrainian political identity and what meant to be Ukrainian. And it was very much interconnected with all of these like social ideas that I described. For being a Ukrainian was a political decision because you were under occupation of Russian Empire or Austro-Hungarian Empire. And if you're proudly calling yourself Ukrainian, you're protesting. And if you're protesting against something. And it was just by being calling yourself Ukrainian or speaking Ukrainian language, you already made a statement in terms of different oppressions. Because Ukrainians were peasants under serfdom, statement "I am Ukrainian" was protest against regime of serfdom and regime of economic exploitation. Then, because Ukraine was occupied under foreign powers, saying "I'm Ukrainian" was a call for self-governance and independence. And because Ukraine was ruled over by kings, tsars, saying "I'm Ukrainian" was a Republican call, because the system of monarchy was oppressing Ukrainians. So on this basis, practically all the first Ukrainian organizations formed in some kind of socially progressive, economically progressive Republican parties. And first Ukrainian political party was actually a socialist party. It was called Radical Party. It was founded by Ivan Franko, who is also on our paper money. And it was party that was ahead of its age. It was practically ethical socialist party with a lot of influence from anarchism, from Proudhon, from Bakunin, but also with very deep sense of constitutionalism, human rights, national rights, and social equality and political equality. It was party of that interconnected the idea of Ukrainian independence with the idea of social and economic liberation and social struggle. Ukraine was the state where Ukrainian people could be free from social, economic, and political oppression. And kind of this idea of just transcend all political Ukrainian movements until actual foundation of Ukrainian state in 1917. In 1917, during Russian Revolution, all Russian Revolution, there were happening a lot of national revolutions that were under the that were happening in the same process as the dissolution of Russian Empire. There were revolutions in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Crimea, Belarus, Baltic region, Central Asia, Siberia, and so on and so on. There were a lot of national states that were born, and nearly all of them had their progressive and social-oriented government. And first Ukrainian state was Ukrainian People's Republic, a state that was founded practically by socialists, by democratic socialists, by two parties. First was Marxist Ukrainian Social Democratic Workers' Party and Socialist Revolutionary Ukrainian Party of Socialist Revolutionaries. They guided Ukrainian life and practically for formation of modern Ukrainian state by their policies. And these were pretty much innovative and very modern policies. Okay, I need to drink some after 10 minutes of talk, so 1 second. You could ask me some question, but I'll have half a minute break.
Well, we got questions piling up, and plan to get to them in about 10 minutes. So, are you ready to go back, or?
Yeah. Okay. So, Ukrainian People's Republic was a very innovative state, and some would call it probably the first democratic socialist state in the entire world. Of course, we could discuss, say, maybe it was Paris Commune that was the first democratic socialist state, and so on, depending on the definition. But Ukraine was a pretty solid case of actual existing democratic socialism, where they were practicing different systems that we are now agitating for. In terms of Ukraine, it was practically a state where there was extremely strong cooperative movement, and it was one of the strongest in Europe, except in UK, they were stronger. But the cooperative movement gave a huge economic force to support Ukrainian People's Republic and organized its, at the same time, socialist transition. It was a republic where practically means of production were at the hands of peasants and workers through cooperatives, through consumption cooperatives, through the manufacturing cooperatives, through the agrarian cooperatives, co-organized in cooperative federations and governed practically autonomously economic system of the country. When the Bolsheviks were conquering Ukraine, they were saying that they need to deal with actually existing cooperative country and to put down resistance from the cooperative movement. So the basis of Ukrainian People's Republic was, even in the economic system, it was hugely progressive, practically that what we can now call market socialist country. At the same time, in terms of financial policies, Ukraine was one of the first countries to introduce kind of Keynesian policies. We had very important economist Tugan Baranovsky, who was financial minister in Ukrainian People's Republic, who was one of the actual influence on the Keynes theories himself. And he proposed pretty much innovative ways of social spending and welfare and just state intervention in the economy that practically was extremely important to bring in thousands of people out of poverty. At the same time, Ukraine maintained its democratic system. It wasn't one-party state. It wasn't a state where everything dominated by some kind of higher authority, but pretty much where at the central power with different local institutions that were preserving democracy, and at the same time with a lot of national institutions. Ukraine was the first country to introduce the conception of national personal autonomy, meaning that in Ukraine, there were not only like your usual ministries, but there also were ministries of nationality. And every nationality in Ukraine had their possibility of self-governance, their part of budget that was only for them, their own elections, to decide how they address their own specific national problems, all their specific needs of their national communities, in complete autonomy from the government itself. And it was extremely progressive, and it made possibility for communities in Ukraine to pursue their own interests and defend against attacks on their rights. And later this system was introduced also in Baltic states, but unfortunately not for long. But Ukraine kind of paved the way. And at the same time, Ukraine was probably had the possibility of becoming one of the first councilist, actual councilist socialist state. There were two wings of Ukrainian revolution. One of the democratic socialists who envisioned Ukraine as kind of this cooperative economically state, but parliamentarian democracy on one wing. And there were radicals who imagined Ukraine in the way of kind of councilist Soviet republic, but independent from Russian influence, multi-partisan. And during the revolution, Ukraine kind of went in the both directions simultaneously and introduced a lot of local councilist mechanism, workers' power, and so on, while nationally it was parliamentarian. But at the same time, there were a lot of movements who are moving in that direction. But unfortunately, all of this great, huge progressive experiment faced invasions from different countries, from Lenin government, from the Bolsheviks, who were fighting separatism. They didn't accept dissolution of Russian Empire, and they wanted to bring other countries in fold. They came here, they usually extracted resources and very colonial practices like grain extraction and so on, and were practically destroying Ukraine and subjugating it for colonial practices. And unfortunately, Ukraine didn't survive against Bolshevik attacks, and they occupied the country and established one-party state and repressed all the socialist movements here. And after that, the main Ukrainian socialist movement was dissidents who, even in system of Soviet oppression, organized resistance. And many of them were also from socialist or Euro-communist background and promoted ideas of socialism with human face, majority of them. So that's kind of the background of Ukrainian history. And in all of this history, like most of its time, it was dominated by left wing, except a small period of time when only after Soviet occupation, there was reaction where people started thinking, if our socialists failed, what was the reason? And some of them said that the reason was because we were too democratic, too socialists. And because of that, we got the reaction, the far-right movement, with Bandera and so on, which played only a small part in Ukrainian history. And the movement itself, in many ways, was dominated by grassroots members who came there and actually were opposing the ideas of far-right. But practically all of history of Ukraine, except this small period, was a history of social struggles, political struggles that are identical to left-wing beliefs. And it was the case until 1991. And I think learning about that history, acknowledging it, and just discussing it, it creates an important context how to approach Ukrainian-Russian war right now, how to approach why Russia tries to destroy Ukraine, how to approach Ukrainian identity, and how to understand all of this resistance that is going on against Russia right now. And all of this, I think it's extremely important to learn about Ukrainian history and finally put it in the right place in the history of world socialist movement and just in general history of the world. Thank you.
That was a great synopsis. There are a number of documents that have been put in the chat, articles and interviews with Vladyslav that you can find out more about this. The only thing I think people need to, learn, take home right now is that it matters how the international left relates to the Ukrainian left, because if they are isolated, there is a small far right in Ukraine. And if Russia, takes over Ukraine or more of Ukraine, they're going to blame, they're going to try to rise up. And so, we need to support the left. And given that Trump is aligning with the far right internationally, that affects us. So we're all in this struggle together. Let's go to the questions that people or comments that people have raised and have Vladyslav comment on those. So here we go. George Johnson Hamilton, two-part question for you today. First, regarding Belarus, and the other is the Orthodox Church, and to what level each play in possible outcomes removing Putin, Zelensky from the equation?
I don't quite understand the question, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm trying to, understand too. I mean, the Orthodox Church is split. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is aligned with Constantinople, and the Russian Church is separated, kind of outcast because of its aggression in Ukraine, and that's been an issue. And the campists say that Ukraine is banning the Orthodox Church, but they're just going after those churches that are collaborating with the Russian invasion.
Exactly. It's kind of an administrative issue. There are two churches of exact same Orthodox Christian beliefs, and one of the church practically was founded during Soviet Union, and its main activities were connected historically with Russia and still connected in some way. And other church was trying to separate from that. And now Ukrainian government attacks the church that was connected with Russia and tries to help independent church. And of course, there are a lot of kind of social unrest because of it, because some people are just used to go to the church that is connected to Russia and so on, which obviously could arise in such a situation. But also it's something that is just needed to be done to remove this kind of influence, possibility of sabotage from the religious communities that were actually created as kind of KGB church. We call it KGB church because it was used a lot during all of the time of Soviet Union for repressions and political control. So it's kind of the issue of making the church independent from Russia. Of course, it comes also with some of its own problems. Yeah, and about Belarus, I don't know what's the question. There are possible threats from escalation from the Belarusian side. The possible, I don't know, a lot of stuff could happen from that situation. So, yeah.
Scout Trooper 164. Zelensky is doing what he can to get through to Putin and Trump. Any thoughts on the way Kellogg is essentially being used as a play, while someone else is talking to the Russians in Saudi Arabia and in Switzerland, as we were talking before? Maybe you could bring that in now.
Yes, practically what what Trump does is tries to strengthen Russian negotiation power and diminish Ukrainian one. And we had practically a meeting between Russian and American representatives where Ukraine wasn't invited, and one secret meeting that was leaked in Switzerland. And what we could from this understand that Trump actively tries to align Russia and force Ukraine to subjugate. He believes in the power of strongest, and so he goes for Russia because he thinks that their imperialist reasons are reasonable. He thinks in the same categories. He in the same categories threatens Canada, Panama, Mexico. That might makes right. So he tries to approach Russia, and he believes that Ukraine is a small country, not as strong as Russia, so it should just shut up. Practically, what we are seeing is kind of Munich scenario of before the Second World War, where big countries trying to divide smaller countries. But in fact, I don't think that any agreement between US and Russia will change the situation on the ground in Ukraine. No agreement of this would stop Ukrainians from fighting.
Ronald at Indian Lake. Ukraine got caught in the middle of a dispute between NATO and Russia. NATO, including the US, should take full responsibility for ending the conflict and paying to rebuild Ukraine. So what do you have to say to that, Vladyslav?
Yeah, Ukraine was caught between Russian ambitions and Russian ambitions. And it is absolutely pointless to blame something except Russia. Russia has huge issues with just existence of Ukraine. They are repeatedly saying on their propagandist channels, on their official rhetoric, on what Putin says, that it is an issue about destruction of Ukraine, about conquering of Ukraine, about the conception of united people of Russia. They think that Ukrainians are part of Russian nation, and because of this should be a part of Russian state. There is nothing about this that is connected to NATO. It's just an issue of blatant imperialism and revanchism. And if you don't believe me, just listen to what Putin says, to what Russian media says, to what their actions on the ground. You don't organize genocide of Ukrainians and force them to Russify, force them to speak Russian language and integrate in your state if your issue with NATO. It doesn't make sense, because Russian issue is actually with Ukraine existing, with Ukraine as independent people existing, having their separate political culture, their separate language, and so on and so on. And Russian approach, including with separation of families, stealing children, massive executions, and so on, are just not possible to bring this in the theory that is somehow conflict between Russia and NATO. It very well could become a conflict of Russia and NATO, but there's only one side to blame, it's Russia. And this idea that NATO just didn't compromise enough with Russia is absurd, because what you would compromise? Ukrainian integrity? It's not something that Democrats and people of progressive humanist mindset would compromise. It just go into the same old world of imperialism, brickering and dividing the world with a pie slice. So it's complete bullshit, to be honest.
Yeah, many Ukrainians have said that blaming Russia invasion on Ukraine, on NATO, is like blaming a woman that got raped for how she looked. And, it's Russia invaded Ukraine. NATO hasn't invaded Russia. It's absurd, but it's the constant propaganda line. So let's go on to the next question. Joanna Munley, are there concerns about war escalating beyond Ukraine and Russia? What are your thoughts regarding this?
I think right now it's a real possibility. It's certainly very real. We have a report of Danish special, I think, counterintelligence. I don't remember who was, but some part of government structure of Denmark reported that Russia could be ready to organize invasion of European countries in around 5 to 10 years. There's, I think, real possibility that it is a mindset of Russia to return to the borders of practically Warsaw Pact, to divide Europe, and so on and so on. And for now, it could sound absurd, like how Russia would go against NATO, all of this power. But we have the situation of 4 years of leadership of Trump in NATO. And we have the situation where European armies are all weaker than Ukrainian army. So Ukrainian army would be the strongest obstacle in Russian conquest of Europe. And if US decides to be neutral in such conflict, it becomes very well possible. Europe doesn't have strong military capabilities to stop Russia, and Russia has imperial ambitions that goes far beyond Ukraine. So it is quite possible that some conflict could escalate between European powers and Russia and go outside of Ukraine. And the only way to completely prevent this possibility is to stop Russia in Ukraine. It's just simple. To destroy Russian army here so it couldn't attack anywhere else. It's the only way that guarantees the security of the continent for 100%. All other ways still create different risks, possibilities of escalations, possibilities of new genocides. So the best solution is just to support Ukraine for Ukrainian victory.
Scout Trooper 164, any thoughts on MAGA versus MAGA due to the heavy division between the two sides on Zelensky.
MAGA versus MEGA. I think
I've heard, people like Kellogg are not as pro-Russian as Trump and Vance and the Treasury Secretary Bessent and then Marco Rubio, based on his past statements, is really probably not down with what Trump is saying, but he's such a kiss ass, he's going to go along. So I think that's what this question is referring to.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't think that there left any independent force in the Republican Party who toes the line about Ukraine. It's all about Trump, it's all about Musk, G.D. Vance, and they're practically settling the policy, and nobody wants to oppose them from the Republican Party. I don't think that there could be any of these divisions arising from the mega camp. I think even like from the general Republican broader camp, there are no force that would say that we should oppose this insane Trumpist nonsense about Ukraine and Russia and support Ukraine. Right now, it just became kind of cultist party, to be honest, to me. And just everyone stays in line, no matter their opinion. They could vote anything in 2022, but right now they all go to Ukraine and demand the same bullshit, name the same minerals or deal with Russia or anything. And just I don't see any divisions there. Until Trump exists, probably he would be the main force in this.
Ronald at Indian Lake. Trump thinks like a 1980s thinker. Trump wants to return to the bipolar world with East versus West. I believe this is the ambition behind the conflict. The right wing in the U.S. has enabled, I guess RS means Russian state. The U.S. is against a multipolar world. So
I don't think so, because US is actively sabotaging its own influence in Europe, practically. He goes against European Union. He threatens with sanctions practically all of his allies, like Canada, Mexico, and so on and so on. So I think what Trump wants is just like blatant imperialism, extractivism, and just muscle policies. It doesn't care about creating Cold War scenario, about creating a world of two blocks, because Trump doesn't care about usual American allies. He actually goes. You probably heard this, like G.D. Vance speak about European Union, how he attacked Greta Thunberg and said that if you survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg, you could survive a few years of Musk, which is insanity. I love Greta Thunberg. I think we should have more of her and less of Musk. But US practically attacks all of its possible allies. It doesn't care. I think the only bloc that could be here is not East and West, but dictators against flawed democracies. And he just aligns with every possible dictator. I think in some way he would probably drop his hard position on China and also try to find some similar interests with them, because his constant rhetoric is undermining at least like all the democratic states and supporting authoritarian states. Unfortunately, it is the case, and I don't think it's about dividing the world to two blocks. I don't think that there's like super great vision around it. I think it's just like supporting far right everywhere.
Chris Blankenhorn, is it actually multipolar if both poles are far right? Much of the left has been sucked into this multipolar equals good, regardless of who the other pole is.
Yeah, practically, it is exactly what I'm saying. It's practically Trump is creating the world where far right would dominate, because he's far right and he's authoritarian, and he wants a world of simple-minded, similar people to him, and the world where he could have his own, where he could behave like a gangster and nobody would stop him. So that's his idea of multipolarity, and that's the idea that tankists are supporting. And I think all of this discussion about multipolarity, not multipolarity, is not very it shouldn't be central for the left. The left should think about focusing on the centrality of human rights, international law, and principles of just democratic principles and solidarity around the world. And no matter how many poles or factions there would be. Because right now this discussion about multipolarity is just discussion about creating multiple imperialist centers to kill other people. For example, I think Trump administration discussing right now withdrawing forces from northeast Syria, from Kurdistan, which would obviously open new possibilities for Turkey to invade. So logic of Trump multipolarity is just creating the world super dangerous for all the small nations, for the big nation to practically chew on them.
Yeah, that's when I said, the world changed in the last couple of weeks because the U.S., at least on paper, not always in practice, was committed to the post-World War II, UN Charter and, democracy, human rights, and international law against aggressive wars. And now from Trump, we're getting might makes right. And, they're going to divide the world up between Russia, the US, China, and smaller imperialist powers like Turkey, which is going into Rojava in Syria, and some other smaller imperial powers. But it's not about democratic principles, it's about who's got the power. And the little guys just have to take it. That's the way they look at the world. They don't believe in democracy. I'm talking about Trump and Putin. Josh Schofeli, hope I pronounced that right. It will take the Russian citizens to change anything that would make a difference.
Russian citizens practically are on board with Putin's conquest because ideas that Putin promotes, they were not born with Putin and they were shared by general Russian nationals. It was something that was popular during Soviet times and popular during Yeltsin times. The idea of Russia as uniting force of Ukraine, Belarus, and so on was on the mind of ordinary Russian citizens. And you could hear so much racism, xenophobia to other people coming from just ordinary people in Russia that there's certainly a social basis of Putin's dictatorship. There are a lot of people who are revanchists, who have their anger, who have this imperialist complex, who want to return their stolen land, and so on and so on. So I would say that there are no powerful organization, citizenry, or something in Russia that oppose this idea. They're practically all in line. They could discuss if they agree with Putin's style of governance, if they want more democracy, more militaristic regime, more ethno-nationalist regime. They could disagree on this, but pretty much all the main forces in Russia, including Russian opposition, mostly are in line with this role of Russia as imperialist state. So I don't think that there are a lot of possibility of Russian citizens leading some change.
Scout Trooper 164, any thoughts on Jake Bro listing Zelensky as the Democratic leader of the world, thanks to Trump being a greedy dick?
Yeah, it's a great formulation. Zelensky as a person certainly is not a leader of the democratic world or something, but Ukrainians as a nation, they are, because what we are struggling, what we are fighting against on the front line is a fight that in all the different ways are shared by most of the democratic countries. It's a fight against far right, against imperialism, against the destruction of world order, and so on and so on and so on. What we are doing practically, if we defeat Russia, it would mean just collapse of far right influence in many countries and many places, liberation of many people, and practically a new hope for democracy. So just in the sense that Ukrainians' actions are practically on the the practically a sharp knife against authoritarian regimes and imperialist regimes. Ukrainians, in some way, could lead a democratic world, but Zelensky is not actually. I wouldn't idealize him. He is a very typical politician. He does a great job to unite the nation, just no doubt about this. He is a great diplomat, and so on and so on. He is a great showman. It's qualities that I respect, and I think he does a great job. But as a democratic leader, he is not that different from this Argentinian guy, from different libertarians or like right-wing politicians. He's not exactly the person who leads the democratic world. In many ways, we are leading just because we are in that unique situation where we are fighting against Russian invasion, but also by the means of fighting against this invasion, we are developing different progressive values. Just because if we are destroying Russian imperialism, we are helping so many other countries to fight their Russian-connected regimes. We are helping against the far right. We are fighting against expansion of values that are promoted by Putin, and so on and so on and so on. Only in this sense, we are kind of the leader of democratic world.
Andrew Hager, what can be done to ensure a more peaceful future for us all, no matter where we live?
Destruction of Russian Federation in its current form would save us in many ways. It would remove the existential dangers that force many countries to very justly think about expanding their military capabilities, and it would just stop a huge ideal example for the far right, because most of the far right are thinking about Russia, about Putin as their some kind of exemplary country with the traditional values and so on and so on. So thinking destroying Russia is not just a matter of solidarity with Ukraine, but also a matter of international struggle against the far right and against this more dangerous world. But of course, there are a lot of different ways to ensure more peaceful future. And unfortunately, most of these ways are extremely hard and usually involve helping struggles of smaller nations against different imperialist bordering countries.
I would just add, as those of us in the U.S., as residents of in the belly of one of the beasts, one of the imperialist beasts, we can make a big difference by transforming our society. And when you live in a capitalist world, all the capitalists are competing for resources, cheap labor, geopolitical military advantage, and the expansive nature of these different national capitalisms creates conflict and war. So you want a peaceful world, we got to change the system. And that's got to be an international struggle. So we need to be in solidarity with those in Ukraine. And, we mentioned Rojava and everywhere else. So, we have a job to do here in the U.S. There was a period coming out of the Vietnam War where a lot of U.S. leftists thought they gave up on the American people and said all we can do is support liberation struggles in the third world, which we should do, but we got to change it at home, and we can't do that. So that's just my little editorial there on that question.
Yeah, I think it's a great addition. I think it's really right thing to think, because I think there are a lot of attitudes from the Americans who think that America are absolutely bad. Nothing we can do about this. Let's focus on other stuff. But of course, there's the core issue that American citizenry are the only one who could save America from being an awful country that ruins lives of many other people. So yeah.
Okay, no new question came up, so we've used up our hour, Vladyslav, and we could go on. Maybe we should have you back again, in a few months and see where things stand. I know that you're under an air alert because I kept my Kyiv notice, and I get them. For the last 40 years, exactly. Kyiv is under an air alert from Russian bombardment. So maybe we should let you get to a safer place. let's put one more thing in the chat. It's an article by Vladyslav Trofimov, who is the foreign affairs editor at the Wall Street Journal. He's a native Ukrainian. And it's about the genocide, the cultural genocide that Russia's perpetuating in the occupied territories, like tearing down statutes commemorating the Holodomor, the genocidal starvation of Ukrainians in the 30s, and many other, monuments to Ukrainian culture. And I know it's behind a paywall. It's on the Wall Street Journal. But I know a lot of you are savvy. You can get around those payrolls if you subscribe. So I thought I would put that. That just came out today. And next week, we're going to have somebody from the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in the UK named Sasha Ismail. We're going to talk about international solidarity and, various questions about that. So we'll have more discussion of Ukraine next week. And Vladyslav, thanks so much for coming on. I think, people got a lot out of this, and, we will spread it around. And everyone else, have a good week. And like I said last week, and I repeat today, if we're going to fight Trump, we can't do it as isolated individuals online. We got to be in groups where we're talking to each other and getting smarter that way and coming up with actions. And the other thing I'm arguing is we need independent political action under the Trump administration at the local level. We need to build a base because the left is too weak in the U.S. right now to influence what goes on in Washington, especially with Trump and Republican majorities in both the House and the Senate. So we gotta build a base so that soon enough, hopefully, we'll be ready to really influence things. So with that, thanks again, Vladyslav, and everybody have a good week.
Thank you, Howie. It's always a pleasure to have discussion with you, and it was a great amount of questions. I am sad that there wasn't a question about history, but it still was good. I was very happy to see you and to discuss it with your followers and people on stream. And I wish you solidarity and successes in your struggles, and have a good day.
All right, everybody.